Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about Genghis Khan, the making of an empire. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The wind comes from the northwest, sweeping down across the open steppe without anything to slow it. No trees, no walls, no hills of consequence. Just the enormous rolling grassland of Central Asia stretching in every direction to the edge of vision. And beyond that edge more of the same. More grass and more sky and more wind. The light today is the light of late afternoon. Long and golden and slightly melancholy. The kind of light that makes the grass look like it is made of something precious, copper wire, hammered bronze, the fur of some large sleeping animal. The shadows of the few clouds above are moving across that grass at a walking pace, their shapes shifting and dissolving as you watch. And the sound the wind makes through the short steppe grass is a low, continuous breath, patient and enormous, like the breathing of the land itself. Somewhere to the east, a river threads through a valley, the Hoelun, swift and clear and cold, running down from the mountains of Kentii where the snow persists even in summer. And beside that river, in a camp of felt tents, jars, each one a warm round world of its own, smelling of smoke and lanolin and boiled meat. A people are living the way their ancestors lived, following the grass, following the animals, reading the sky. Tonight we will walk slowly through one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the world, the life of Temujin, who was born beside the Hoelun River in the middle of the 12th century and who became, in the fullness of time, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the man who built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It is a story that unfolds across an almost incomprehensible stretch of landscape, from the Pacific coast of Asia to the borders of Eastern Europe, from the Siberian forests to the Persian deserts. But it begins here, in the grass, in the wind, beside the cold river, in the ordinary circumstances of a nomadic childhood on the Mongolian steppe. Let the wind carry you in. Let the smell of the cooking fire find you. Tonight there is only the steppe, and the sky above it, and the long patient unfolding of a life that changed the world. To understand Genghis Khan, you must first understand the steppe. The Eurasian steppe is the largest grassland on Earth, a band of open country that runs from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east. For 1,000 miles of grass and sky and wind, interrupted only occasionally by rivers and by the ranges of mountains that divide its western and eastern halves. It is not a gentle landscape. The winters are ferocious, temperatures that drop to -40 degrees in the Mongolian interior, blizzards that come without warning and can kill a herd of horses in an afternoon. The summers are short and intense, the grass growing fast in the brief warm months, and the nomadic people of the steppe learned, over thousands of years, to read every signal the land offered, the direction of the wind, the behavior of animals, the color of the horizon, the way the grass bent, because reading those signals correctly was the difference between survival and death. This was a world that rewarded attention and punished carelessness. A world where the skills needed to live were transmitted precisely and seriously from one generation to the next, and where the ability to ride and to read landscape and to manage animals was not a specialty but a universal baseline competency. The horse is the central fact of steppe civilization, the animal around which everything else organized itself. The Mongolian horse is not a large creature, compact and stocky, with a broad head and a thick neck and a dense winter coat that grows remarkable in the cold months. More like a bear's pelt than what you might expect of an animal designed for speed. But it is extraordinarily hardy. It can survive on the open steppe through the worst winters by pawing through the snow to reach the grass beneath, without supplemental feed, without shelter, maintaining a body condition that a European horse would require barn and grain to match. It can travel distances that would exhaust other breeds. And the Mongol warriors who rode it had been in the saddle since before they could walk, which is not a figure of speech. Mongol children were placed on horseback as toddlers and spent much of their early childhood in this way, developing a relationship with the animal and with the rhythm of movement it provided that became, over years, something close to instinctive. A Mongol warrior on horseback was not a man riding a horse. He was a compound creature, something new, operating with a unity of horse and rider that gave him capabilities no foot soldier and few other cavalry traditions could match. The bow he carried, a recurve bow of composite construction, made from layers of horn and sinew and wood laminated together under tension, capable of driving an arrow through armor at considerable range, was designed to be fired from horseback at the gallop, and Mongol warriors practiced this skill from childhood until it was not a skill but a reflex. The Mongols of the 12th century were one of many tribal peoples living on the eastern steppe, and they were not the most powerful among them. The Tatars to the south and east were stronger. The Karaites in the central steppe had converted to Christianity and had elaborate political structures. The Naimans to the west were considered more sophisticated. The Mongols were a collection of clans and subclans, sometimes allied, more often feuding, organized around the fundamental unit of the nomadic world, the family group, the extended clan, the tent community that moved together through the seasons. Loyalty in this world was intensely personal and intensely local. You were loyal to your family, your clan, your sworn companions. The concept of a unified Mongol people, a nation, an identity that transcended clan, barely existed when Temujin was born. It would be one of his life's central achievements to create it. Temujin was born, according to the great chronicle of his life, The Secret History of the Mongols, written not long after his death and one of the most remarkable literary documents of the medieval world, around the year 1162. His father was Yasuji, a minor chieftain of a Mongol clan called the Borjigin, a man of some reputation as a warrior but of limited power and limited followers. His mother was Hoelun, a woman from the Okhunut clan who, by the customs of the steppe, had been taken as a wife by Yasuji while she was already married to another man, abducted, essentially, in a raid, which was an accepted, if not comfortable, feature of steppe society. Hoelun would prove to be one of the formative influences on her son's life, a woman of extraordinary resilience and practical intelligence, whose example of strength under duress left a deep mark on the boy she raised. The name Temujin, sometimes translated as meaning something like blacksmith or one who works iron, was given to the boy at his birth in a way that connected him to a moment of his father's success. Yasuji had just captured a Tatar warrior of that name in a raid, and in the custom of the steppe, he named his newborn son for his prisoner, transferring, as the custom suggested, something of the captured man's power and fate to the new life. The child was born, according to the secret history, clutching a clot of blood in his right hand, the size of a knuckle bone, an omen, the chroniclers said, of the warrior he would become. These are the details that legend adds to great lives after the fact, the retrospective signs and portents that declare, even at the beginning, this one was marked. Whether the blood clot is literally true, it is true in the deeper sense that every great life is narrated backward. Read from its ending, and the ending of Temujin's life was so astonishing that people felt something must have announced it at the start. His childhood was disrupted at the age of perhaps 9 or 10 when his father Yasuji was poisoned, treacherously given poisoned food by Tatars whose hospitality he had accepted while traveling. Yasujii died within days of his return home. And with the death of the father, the family's position collapsed. The followers that Yasujii had gathered around him, the men and families who had attached themselves to his leadership in the clan structure of steppe life, simply left. They transferred their allegiance to other leaders, following the logic of a world where survival depended on being connected to effective power. Hoelun, with her several children and a small group of loyal relatives, was abandoned on the steppe, left to fend for herself. What followed was several years of genuine hardship, the widow and her children surviving through the cold seasons on whatever they could forage: berries, roots, mice, fish from the river. It was a childhood of scarcity and exposure and the particular education that real deprivation provides. The secret history gives us Hoelun in this period with a vividness that centuries have not dimmed. It describes her walking the riverbanks collecting wild plants, juniper berries, pine nuts, garlic, onions, carrying a birch staff, her skirts gathered, feeding her children from what the land offered. It records her words to her sons, urging them toward unity, toward the understanding that, in the absence of clan support, only the family itself could be relied upon absolutely. The speech the secret history puts in her mouth, a long, urgent address full of animal metaphors, comparing her children to a single arrow shaft that cannot be broken, to a bundle of sticks bound together that no hand can snap, may be literary elaboration after the fact, but the substance of it rings true as the formation of a conviction that would mark Temujin for the rest of his life. He knew, from this period, what abandonment felt like. He knew what it cost to lose the loyalty of followers. He knew that loyalty, once earned, must be maintained with an active and continuous care, and that the alternative was the river bank and the wild onions and the particular cold silence of the steppe when no one is coming. The steppe at night is one of the most extraordinary sights in the natural world. The absence of any artificial light means that the sky performs its full show without interference. And the sky of the Mongolian interior at this latitude, at this altitude, in this dry continental air, is a sky of almost painful intensity. The Milky Way is not a suggestion here, but a solid structure. A river of light so dense and so clearly resolved that you can see its depth, its distance, its extraordinary lateral spread across the full arc of the heavens. The stars are doubled in the river below if you are near the Onan, their cold light trembling in the current, disrupted and reformed with every ripple. The temperature drops fast after dark on the steppe, even in summer, and the cold comes cleanly, without humidity, pressing against the skin with a clarity that is almost pleasant after the day's warmth. The horses stand near the camp, their shapes dark and patient, their breath rising in small clouds. And the gur is warm inside, the central fire burning low, the smoke rising through the hole at the apex of the felt roof into the enormous dark above. Temujin grew through his adolescence into a young man of, by all accounts, remarkable personal presence. The secret history describes him with golden eyes and a ruddy complexion, physical features that marked him as unusual among a people where darker eyes were the norm, and that the chroniclers associated with his exceptional nature. He was, by the evidence of what he accomplished, someone who combined physical courage with an unusual quality of mind, patient where his contemporaries were impulsive, strategic where they were reactive, capable of holding a long intention in mind across years of setback and delay. He also had, from the beginning, an understanding of loyalty and betrayal that was both personal and political, formed, no doubt, in the crucible of his abandonment after his father's death, shaped by the specific and painful education of learning, as a child, that the allegiance of followers is not given permanently but must be continuously earned and maintained. His early adult life was shaped by several foundational relationships and several foundational crises. The first was his marriage to Borte, a girl from the Okanut clan to whom he had been betrothed by his father before Yasugei's death, a betrothal Temujin honored when he came of age, traveling to claim his bride and bring her back to his camp. Borte would be the great constant of his life, his first and principal wife, the mother of his 4 legitimate sons, a woman whose counsel he valued and whose intelligence matched his own. The marriage brought with it a political alliance and a magnificent gift, a sable fur coat that Temujin used shrewdly as the opening move in his reconstruction of power, gifting it to Togrul, the Christian Khan of the Karait tribe, in exchange for Togrul's patronage and protection. This was Temujin at work, converting a personal resource into a political relationship, turning a coat into an alliance. Then came the disaster. Not long after his marriage, Borte was taken. A rival group, the Merkits, who had an old grievance against the Borjigin dating from Hoelun's own abduction, raided Temujin's camp in the night and carried Borte away. It was a devastating blow, both personal and political. The loss of his wife, the humiliation of a man who could not protect his household. But Temujin's response was not paralysis. He called on his alliances, on Togrul of the Karates, and on his sworn brother, his Anda, Jamuka, and he gathered enough men to pursue the Merkits and take Borte back. The rescue was accomplished, and when Borte gave birth to a son shortly afterward, Temujin named him Joki and raised him as his eldest without public acknowledgement of the uncertainty about his parentage. A decision that spoke to his understanding of what public unity required and what private ambiguity could be sustained in the service of a larger purpose. The alliance with Jamuka is one of the great complex relationships of Temujin's life. They were Anda sworn brothers, a bond on the steppe that was meant to supersede even blood loyalty, a chosen kinship sealed by ceremony and by the sharing of food and goods and fate. They had been Anda as children, and they renewed the bond as young men, and for a while they rode together, camped together, shared everything. But the paths of two ambitious men on the steppe, each gathering followers, each building toward power, could not remain parallel indefinitely. After about a year of shared camp, they separated, and the separation marked the beginning of a long rivalry that would not be resolved until they faced each other directly. Years later, as leaders of opposing confederations. The story of Temujin and Jamuka is the story of two men who might, under different circumstances, have shared the steppe, but the steppe, in the end, could contain only one supreme power. Let your breathing slow a little now. The fire in the gur has burned to coals. Their orange glow steady in the darkness, and the felt walls of the tent are keeping out the steppe wind with their characteristic efficiency. Felt being one of the great insulating materials in the world, dense and flexible, the compressed wool of the very animals that grazed the grass outside. The smell of the interior is warm and animal and smoky. Someone has left a bowl of arag near the fire, the fermented mare's milk that is the essential drink of the Mongolian steppe, slightly sour and slightly alcoholic and exactly right for a cold night on the open grass. The horses outside are making small sounds, shifts of weight, the occasional soft vocalization that horses make when they are settled and safe. Let the warmth of the gur settle around you. There is no urgency in this darkness. No rus. The steppe is old. The night is long. We are in no hurry. The decade or so between Temujin's early 30s and his proclamation as Genghis Khan was a period of extraordinary political construction, as methodical and deliberate as the building of a great stone wall, if considerably more fluid and considerably more dangerous. He gathered followers through a combination of military success, personal magnetism, and an organizational intelligence that was genuinely novel on the steppe. The traditional steppe confederation was a fragile thing, a cluster of tribal units that cohered around a successful leader and dispersed when he faltered, each component retaining its own identity and its own loyalty structures. Temujin understood, perhaps better than any previous steppe leader, that this fragility was the fundamental weakness of nomadic political life, and he worked systematically to replace it with something more durable. He began to reorganize his followers not by clan but by decimal units, groups of 10, of 100, of 1,000, of 10,000. These units were commanded by officers appointed by Temujin himself on the basis of demonstrated ability and personal loyalty, not inherited clan status. A man of no noble lineage who showed courage and intelligence and loyalty could rise to command a unit of 1,000. A man of aristocratic birth who failed his Khan could be demoted or replaced. This was revolutionary. It cut across the clan structures that had always organized steppe society and replaced them with a loyalty that ran directly to the ruler, bypassing the intermediate levels of tribal chieftainship. It was, in effect, the creation of an army that was also a state, a military organization that was also a political one, bound together not by blood and custom but by the personal covenant between the commander and his men. He also created a guard, the keshig, a personal household force that would eventually number 10,000 men, drawn from the sons of his generals and commanders, who lived with him, protected him, and served as the command training ground of the empire. The keshig was simultaneously a bodyguard, a military academy, and a diplomatic instrument. The sons held within it were partly hostages for their father's loyalty and partly future leaders being formed in direct proximity to the Khan's own thinking and decision-making. The intelligence of the arrangement lay in its multiple functions. It bound the commanders to the center through their children. It formed a cadre of future leadership trained in the Khan's own methods and values. And it gave the Khan a core of absolutely loyal warriors whose personal fate was inseparable from his own. By the early years of the 13th century, through a combination of these organizational innovations and a sustained series of military campaigns against the various confederations and tribes of the eastern steppe, the Tatars who had poisoned his father, the Merkits who had taken his wife, the Naimans to the west, the Karaites who had been his allies and then became his rivals. Temujin had achieved something that no Mongol leader before him had managed: the unification of essentially all the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe under a single authority. In the spring of the year 1206, in a great assembly on the bank of the Hoelun River, the same river beside which he had been born, the tribal leaders gathered and proclaimed him by acclamation. They gave him the title Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of the words is debated. It suggests something like universal ruler, rightful ruler, or perhaps oceanic ruler, as vast and encompassing as the sea. He was perhaps in his mid-40s. He had been working toward this moment for most of his adult life. The Hoelun River in early spring would have run high and cold, swollen with snowmelt from the Kentii Mountains, its surface the color of hammered pewter under the pale spring sky. The great assembly, the Kurultai, would have been an extraordinary gathering. Hundreds of white chairs spread across the river plain. The smell of horses and cooking fires everywhere. The sound of voices in a dozen dialects of the Mongolian tongue. The movement of thousands of people and tens of thousands of animals. And at the center of it, a man in his middle years, lean from a lifetime outdoors, his face marked by the steppe's weather, watching the white felt standard, the solda, the spirit banner made from the tail hairs of his finest horses, which was both his battle standard and the vessel of his personal spirit force, being raised above the assembly. Something had been accomplished. Something that had never existed before had been called into being. A nation where before there had been only tribes. The proclamation of the empire brought with it a set of laws, the yasa, the great code of Genghis Khan, that were promulgated and applied across the new Mongol state. The yasa as a complete document has not survived, but its contents are described in enough secondary sources to give a reasonably clear picture. It mandated religious tolerance across the empire, a remarkable provision for the 12th century. Driven partly by the pragmatic recognition that the empire now included people of many faiths, and partly by a genuine steppe tradition of religious pluralism. It prohibited the killing of envoys and ambassadors, a rule Genghis Khan enforced with absolute strictness, and whose violation by his enemies he treated as an unforgivable offense that justified the most extreme response. It established clear protocols for the distribution of plunder and tribute. And it imposed on the empire's people certain common obligations: military service, taxation, the maintenance of the messenger relay system that would become the nervous system of the vast new state. The religious tolerance that the Yasa mandated had deep roots in the steppe's own spiritual tradition. The Mongols of Genghis Khan's era practiced Tengrism, a shamanistic faith organized around the sky god Tengri, the eternal blue heaven that arched above the steppe, and the earth goddess Setujin below, with a rich intermediary world of spirits inhabiting rivers and mountains and animals and ancestors. The shaman, the Boj, was the specialist who could navigate between these worlds, whose songs and drums could communicate with forces beyond ordinary perception, and whose guidance was sought in matters ranging from the weather to the outcome of campaigns. Genghis Khan himself is described as having private conversations with Tengri, ascending a mountain alone to pray and returning with a conviction about the divine sanction for his campaigns. Alongside this indigenous faith, his own extended family included Christians. His mother Hoelun and some of his sons' wives were Nestorian Christians, and Muslims and Buddhists, and this personal experience of religious plurality within his own household may have reinforced the political logic of tolerance. You did not need everyone to worship in the same way. You needed them to fight and trade and pay taxes. The messenger system, the yam, was one of the genuine organizational innovations of the Mongol Empire and one of the things that made its administration possible across distances that would otherwise have been insuperable. Relay stations were established at regular intervals along the main routes of the empire, each station maintaining fresh horses and provisions. A rider carrying an urgent message could travel hundreds of miles in a day, handing his dispatch from station to station, each fresh horse covering its segment at a gallop. Information moved across the steppe at a speed that astonished the sedentary world to the south and west, and the ability of the Khan to know what was happening at the far edges of his territory and to send orders that arrived while circumstances were still as described was a significant military and political advantage. The empire was, among other things, a communications infrastructure. The campaigns that followed the unification of the steppe moved in several directions, driven partly by the genuine military appetite of a confederation whose warriors needed to be employed, and partly by the strategic logic of consolidating power by eliminating neighboring threats. The Jurchen Jin dynasty of northern China, which had long dominated the eastern steppe through a combination of force and political manipulation, playing one Mongol tribe against another, subsidizing rivals, organizing raids, was the first major settled civilization to feel the weight of the new empire. The campaigns against the Jin began in 1211 and would continue for decades, long after Genghis Khan's own death. The great walled cities of northern China, Zhongdu, modern Beijing, and the network of fortified towns around it, fell one by one to an army that had learned, with remarkable speed, to conduct siege warfare against fortifications that no previous nomadic army had been able to reduce. The Mongol approach to siege warfare was illustrative of a broader pattern. They had no tradition of it, and they solved the problem by absorption. They captured engineers. They recruited specialists, Chinese and Persian and later other engineers who understood the construction and operation of siege engines, trebuchets, and mangonels, and they incorporated this technical knowledge directly into their military organization. A Mongol army by the time of the Great Western Campaigns was not simply a cavalry force. It was a combined arms operation that could project force at range with artillery, breach walls, conduct ambushes and feigned retreats with cavalry, and maintain operational coherence across forces separated by hundreds of miles. The feigned retreat, the tactic of appearing to flee, luring a pursuing enemy into a killing ground prepared in advance, then turning and destroying them, was a technique the Mongols brought to a level of refinement that repeatedly destroyed armies that knew about it intellectually but could not resist the tactical temptation it offered. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire in the West, the great Persianate Empire that controlled much of modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, began in 1219 and was precipitated, in the terms the Mongols themselves understood it, by an act of profound diplomatic offense. Genghis Khan had sent a caravan of merchants to the Khwarezmian Empire as a gesture of opening trade relations, accompanied by an embassy of diplomats. The governor of the border city of Otrar, acting, it was later claimed, on the orders of the Shah Muhammad, had the merchants massacred and the ambassadors executed. To Genghis Khan, the killing of ambassadors was among the gravest possible violations of the law he had built his state on, and his response was total. He assembled an army of perhaps 100,000 men and moved west with a systematic thoroughness that left the Khwarezmian Empire in ruins. The Mongol army that moved west in 1219 was a genuinely multi-ethnic force by this point in the empire's development. Mongols at its core, but incorporating Turkic contingents, Chinese engineers, and scouts and specialists drawn from every people the empire had absorbed. Genghis Khan organized it with the same decimal structure he had imposed on the original Mongolian Confederation, and he moved it according to a strategic plan that divided the army into several columns, each striking a different axis simultaneously, so that the defending forces could not concentrate against any single thrust without exposing themselves to another. The psychological dimension of the campaign was managed as deliberately as the military one. Cities that submitted without resistance were treated leniently, their populations spared, their commerce preserved. Cities that resisted were subjected to the full Mongol response. And the news of what that response entailed, carried ahead of the army by refugees and merchants, frequently caused the next city to reconsider its options. The campaign was, among other things, an exercise in the strategic use of reputation. The cities of Central Asia that fell in those years: Samarkand, Bokhara, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, were among the great cities of the medieval world, centers of Islamic scholarship and art and commerce and architecture, cities of libraries and madrasas and bazaars and mosques, whose tile work and calligraphy represented the apex of a sophisticated civilization. What happened to them varied considerably. Some cities that surrendered immediately were treated with relative restraint. Their populations spared, their functions preserved. Others that resisted, or that had committed particular offenses, were destroyed with a completeness that left later travelers describing fields of bones and empty ruins where great cities had stood. The human cost of the Khwarezmian campaign was enormous, and it constitutes the darkest chapter of Genghis Khan's history, the moment when the capacity for violence that had always been present in the Mongol enterprise was turned without restraint on a civilization that had not expected it. It is necessary to sit with this reality, as the instructions for any honest account of this period require. The destruction wrought by the Mongol campaigns was real. The populations killed were real. The libraries burned and the irrigation systems broken and the agricultural hinterlands depopulated. These were real losses, some of them permanent, reshaping the demography and ecology of large parts of Asia for centuries afterward. The complexity of Genghis Khan as a historical figure lies precisely here. That the same man who created genuinely novel administrative structures and enforced religious tolerance and organized one of the most effective communication systems in the pre-modern world was also responsible for destruction on a scale that had few parallels in history. Both things are true. The historian's task is not to resolve this tension but to hold it, to see both the builder and the destroyer in the same frame, without flinching from either. And yet there were always those who served the empire and found in it something workable, something that offered order and opportunity where before there had been chaos and vulnerability. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace that would eventually extend across most of the Eurasian landmass under Genghis Khan's successors, was a real phenomenon. Travelers in the later decades of the 13th century described being able to move from one end of Asia to the other under safe conduct, protected by the imperial postal system and the rule of law that the Yasa represented, trading across distances that would previously have been made impossible by the political fragmentation of the steppe. Marco Polo made his famous journey through a world shaped by the Mongol consolidation. The Silk Road, whose trade had been disrupted by centuries of political instability, flowed again under Mongol protection. The flows of people and goods and ideas that crossing that landscape enabled, including the eventual transmission of plague, which was among the most devastating unintended consequences of increased Eurasian connectivity, were the direct result of the empire that had been built. The night on the steppe is very still now. The wind that moved through the grass all evening has dropped, and in the stillness you can hear, faintly, the river, the Hoelun, still running in its valley to the east, cold and clear and constant, indifferent to everything that has happened along its banks. The stars above are very bright and very numerous, and the silence under them is the silence of an enormous space that is not empty but full of grass and wind memory, and the slow movements of animals and the particular density of a darkness that has no human light in it for 100 miles in any direction. This is the silence that formed the people of the steppe. This is the silence that formed Temujin. A silence you learn to be comfortable in, or you do not survive it. A silence that teaches patience. Genghis Khan's personal character, as it emerges from the accounts that survive, the secret history, the Persian chronicles, the Chinese records, the reports of diplomats and travelers, is not what legend has made of it. He was not, by the evidence, simply a destroyer. He was a man of considerable intellectual curiosity who surrounded himself with advisors from many cultures, who asked questions and listened to the answers, who was genuinely interested in the ideas of the religious traditions his campaigns brought him into contact with. Taoist monks and Buddhist scholars and Muslim clerics and Nestorian Christian priests all found audiences with him and were treated with real engagement. He is recorded as asking a Taoist sage named Qiu Chuji to travel across Asia to his camp to discuss the nature of the universe and the possibility of immortality. He asked. He listened. He was, whatever else he was, curious about the world. He was also, by the evidence, a man who formed deep and sustaining loyalties and who honored them across the full span of his life. His general Subutai, who became one of the greatest military commanders in world history, was the son of a blacksmith, a man of no noble lineage who had attached himself to Temujin early and demonstrated qualities that Temujin recognized and elevated. G. Another of his great generals, had actually shot Temujin's horse from under him in battle before joining him, and Temujin, when the man presented himself afterward, recognized the combination of skill and honesty and made him a commander. The ability to recognize ability regardless of its origin, and to reward and trust it once recognized, was perhaps his most important leadership quality and the one most responsible for the extraordinary caliber of the men around him. Borte remained at the center of his life. In a world where powerful men accumulated dozens of wives, and Genghis Khan was no exception to steppe custom in this regard, Borte's position as first wife and great queen was never in doubt. She traveled with the campaigns to a degree unusual for the wives of commanders, and her counsel was sought and given on matters of significance. When Genghis Khan was determining who among his sons should succeed him, a question complicated by the uncertain paternity of Joki, the eldest, and by the very different personalities and capacities of his four legitimate sons, it was Borte who argued strenuously and effectively for the succession of her third son, Ogidi, a man of moderate capacity and considerable good humor, who would hold the empire together after his father's death with a competence that its situation required. The later years of Genghis Khan's campaigns turned south and west, toward the Tangut kingdom of Xixia in the northwest of modern China, against whose population the Khan had a sustained and personal grievance, and toward the continuing reduction of the Jin dynasty in northern China. He did not live to see the Jin's final fall. In the summer of 1227, while on campaign against Xixia, Genghis Khan died. He was perhaps in his early 60s old, by the brutal physical accounting of a lifetime in the saddle. The precise cause of his death is uncertain. The accounts mention a fall from a horse, illness, wounds from combat. The secret history is uncharacteristically reticent about the details, as though the moment was too large to be described directly. He had asked to be buried without ceremony, his grave unmarked, and this wish was apparently honored with thoroughness so complete that his burial site has never been found. He returned to the steppe from which he came, leaving no physical monument, only the empire. What he left behind was vast. The empire at his death extended from the Pacific coast of Asia to the Caspian Sea, from the forests of Siberia to the Persian Gulf, encompassing the territory of dozens of previous kingdoms and civilizations. Under his sons and grandsons it would expand further still, reaching its greatest extent in the middle of the 13th century under Kublai Khan in the east and the various successor khanates in the west. The Mongol Empire at its height was the largest contiguous land empire in history, and no empire before or since has controlled such an expanse of the Earth's surface under a single political authority. It reshaped the map of Eurasia permanently, destroying some states and creating others, redirecting trade routes, mixing populations, and enabling the cultural exchanges, including the westward transmission of papermaking, printing, gunpowder, and the compass from China that would eventually contribute to the transformations of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration in Europe. The Secret History of the Mongols, the extraordinary text composed not long after Genghis Khan's death, written in Mongolian, discovered by the outside world only in the 19th century, preserves the voice of the steppe in a way that nothing else does. It is not a chronicle in the conventional sense. It is a narrative shaped by oral tradition, full of poetry and dialogue and the particular rhythms of a literature that had existed in spoken form long before it was written down. It records Temujin's story from his birth to the early years of the empire with a vividness and a specificity that feel, across the 8 centuries since its composition, genuinely alive. The account of the young Temujin and his brother killing a companion in a quarrel over a fish. The description of Hoelun gathering wild onions and berries to feed her children during the years of abandonment. The recorded words of Borte, arguing for Ogdi's succession with a pragmatic ferocity that carries conviction even in translation. These are not the details of official history. They are the details of a life. The legacy of Genghis Khan in the world today is present in more ways than are commonly recognized. The genetic studies of recent decades have found that a very large number of men across the breadth of Asia, estimates range up to 16 million, carry a Y chromosome lineage that traces to a single common ancestor who lived in the region of Mongolia around 1,000 years ago, and who fathered a very large number of children across a very large area, including through his sons and grandsons who inherited his empire and his habits. The genetic record makes visible what the historical record confirms. The Khan and his male descendants spread their lineage with the breadth of their empire. He is, in a literal biological sense, an ancestor shared by an astonishing fraction of the human population of Central Asia. The Mongolian nation today, modern Mongolia, a country of perhaps 3 million people on the high steppe of Central Asia, holds Genghis Khan as its founding father, its Washington, its Charlemagne, its origin story. His face is on the currency. The international airport in Ulaanbaatar is named for him. A vast equestrian statue of him, over 100 feet tall, stainless steel, brilliant in the steppe sun, stands on the banks of the Tul River not far from the capital, the largest equestrian statue in the world. His gaze directed east toward the landscape of his birth. In the context of Mongolian national identity, the violence of his campaigns recedes somewhat behind the achievement of unification, the creation, for the first time, of a single Mongolian people with a shared identity and a shared story. The steppe at the edge of night is beginning to cool in earnest now, the temperature dropping in that swift and total way that only open high-altitude grassland can manage. The warmth draining out of the air with a completeness that makes the cold feel clean and final rather than merely unpleasant. The horses have moved closer to the camp, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the presence of the people they know. One of them shakes its head, its mane briefly silvered in the starlight, then settles again. The grass has gone silver too. In the moonlight, stretching away in all directions to the dark low line of the horizon. And above that line the stars are in their full array. The same stars that were above this same grass 800 years ago. The same stars that Temujin looked up at as a child on this plateau. And as a young man rebuilding his power from nothing, and as the greatest ruler the steppe had ever produced. The stars are keeping their own account. They do not simplify. Let the distance of it settle over you. Now, gently. 8 centuries. The steppe does not much acknowledge the centuries. The grass grows and is grazed and grows again. The seasons turn. The wind comes from the northwest and then from another direction. The snow comes and the snow melts. The rivers rise and fall. The empire that was built on this grass grew to its extraordinary extent and then, in the way of empires, fragmented and was absorbed by the civilizations around it, its ruling families converting to Islam in the West, to Buddhism in the East, their descendants eventually becoming indistinguishable from the populations they had once ruled. The steppe absorbed them back, as it absorbs everything, patiently, without comment. What remains is the grass and the wind and the cold clear rivers and the enormous sky and, in the earth somewhere, unmarked and undiscovered, the bones of the man who rode out of this landscape and changed the world beyond recognition. There is something in the story of Genghis Khan that resists the simple verdicts, hero or villain, destroyer or creator, monster or genius. He was a man formed by a specific world, a specific set of circumstances, a specific code of values, and he pursued the logic of that world with a consistency and a skill that surpassed everyone around him. The steppe rewarded power, loyalty, and the ability to read the landscape and the people in it. Temujin had all three qualities in extraordinary measure. The settled civilizations he encountered had their own logics, their own values, their own codes of conduct, and those codes were not always compatible with the steppes. The collision between these worlds was as much a collision between different ways of understanding what life was for as it was a simple story of conquest. Produced catastrophe, and it also produced connection. It destroyed cities, and it also made possible a century of remarkable cross-cultural exchange. Let your thoughts move slowly now, if they will. The gur is warm and the fire is low and the felt walls are keeping the great cold of the steppe at arm's length. And there is nothing required of you in this moment except to let the story settle, to let the images come to rest. The boy beside the cold river, the young man gathering followers in the wind, the great assembly on the bank of the Hoelun and the white standard rising above it, the armies moving across the steppe in autumn light, the old man on horseback in the shadow of the Tangut Mountains, returning at last to the grass. Let it all rest. It was a long time ago, and the steppe is still there, and the stars above it are the same. The fire is very low now, the coals settling into themselves with small sounds, their glow the color of deep amber, the color of the last light on the grass before the sun goes. The horses outside have gone quiet. The wind across the steppe has gentled into something barely perceptible, just enough to move the grass tips slightly, just enough to remind you that the air is never entirely still here, that the steppe breathes. The sound of the river, somewhere in the east, comes and goes as the wind shifts, a cool liquid sound, the sound of moving water in darkness, the oldest sound. Sleep is like the steppe at night, large and dark and quiet and full of something you cannot name. Comes not all at once but gradually, the way the dark comes after sunset on the open grass, each shade a little deeper than the last, each minute further from the light. The thoughts that were moving through you are slowing now, losing their shape, becoming something less defined, more like the wind than like words, passing through and leaving less behind with each passage. The body is heavy and warm. The breath is slow. The enormous sky above the steppe is full of stars, patient and permanent and indifferent to everything except being exactly what they are. The river runs in the dark. The horses dream. The grass moves its silver tips in the last of the night wind. And the steppe holds its enormous silence. And the stars will slowly overhead toward the east where the first pale suggestion of morning is still hours away, still somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, patient as the mountains, patient as the grass. Sleep now. The steppe is keeping watch.